Hi, I'm Keith. I'm known as the Chocolate Shaman, and I got to Guatemala as a tourist in 2003 and immediately had a visit from the chocolate spirit, the cacao spirit, and missed it. As she came back a few months later, let me get settled in, and she came back and, oh, I remember that energy. You were here before and I missed you. And she invited me on a journey, basically just to have fun. And when I identified, okay, I work with plant spirit medicines and higher dimensional beings and stuff in the many decades before. So when I identified who it was, I really didn't know if I was going to be taught Mayan shamanism or what in working with cacao. But she took me to some real chocolate, which is the problem here in Guatemala. A small percentage of the chocolate is the old varieties. Everything is hybridized. It's mixed with South American varieties. It's got lots of caffeine. It's got a very thick pulp. It needs a long fermentation, and most of that cacao does not work very well for ceremonial purposes. So she led me to Guatemalan cacao that does work. And I began using it and journeying with it, speaking with her, and very quickly found out that, unfortunately, I couldn't just go out and buy it in Guatemala. So I began processing it myself. And my worker would come over and we'd take our shirts off, and a little hand crank grain mill that I'd bought in the 70s in 3 hours would produce 5 pounds. Run it through 3 times, and that's how I started. I started selling it at the door that way. And pretty soon other people wanted it because they realized the value. I spent 3 years traveling from southern Mexico to Panama, buying cacao in markets, visiting indigenous growers, visiting tribal people, visiting chocolate making factories, looking to learn. I kept working with the cacao spirit, and she kept telling me, all right, you're going to have to learn a lot. You're going to have to study commodities markets, fair trade, organic, all of this commercial cacao growing, besides all of the medical journal papers. I've read hundreds of them, all of the stuff out there from the bean to bar makers. And basically from the beginning I realized that I had a plant spirit medicine, an important partner for people. From the beginning, she called herself the food for the shift. And I very quickly realized that this was not about Mayan shamanism. I don't know anything more about Mayan shamanism now than I did back then. But that I was being taught or shown, allowed to discover how to use cacao with the inner work, the inner processing, the working with your shadow, the emotional release work that was back then, 30 years ago, just beginning, and is now sweeping the planet. That initial work grew into cacao ceremonies, and then, right here, we started cacao ecstatic dance, chocolate breath work, chocolate yoga, chocolate kirtan, chocolate sound healing, chocolate hiking, a lot of chocolate therapy, and they are now all over the world. From the beginning, the cacao spirit made it very clear that my website was to share everything I'd learned so that other people wouldn't go through the learning curve that I went through. It's all up there on ceremonialcacao.blogspot.com, and over a period of about 12 years or so, every question that I was ever asked that wasn't in the website answered. I would write it out as a paragraph and find some place to stick it. So it's intended to be a resource base, and it includes very little on the chemical compounds. You can get that elsewhere. It includes very little on the anthropology. That's everywhere. Except to say that the anthropologists are profoundly clueless. I've got books inside on the history of chocolate. I've got them all the way back to the original ones and the new stuff coming out, all the stuff on the web. The closest in all of the anthropological writings I've gotten they get is that cacao is a stimulant. Even the people that deduced that there was cacao in Chaco Canyon, northwestern New Mexico, and have researched that and analyzed the cacao cups they found and that sort of thing, and realized there was a trade of about 900 to 1,000 years ago, or in 900 to 1,000 AD. Maybe that's the correct way to phrase it. Anyway, I digested a massive amount of stuff and realized that although all of the cultures that I've been able to connect with in Central and South America have their cacao shamans, consider it sacred, nobody pays any attention to it. No one knew anything when I started. There was nothing on the web. I contacted local Mayan shamans. They throw some beans in the fire. You exchange beans. When you get married with somebody, I mean, we give chocolate on Valentine's Day. It's understood that it is, as the ancient translation of chocolatl, heart blood. And what's the blood that flows through the heart? Well, poetically, it would be love. What's the food of the gods? Poetically, it would be love. I realized what the purpose of this plant was. Why they would boat it and walk it all the way to New Mexico is because it's an amazing facilitator for journeys in consciousness. I've hung out with the indigenous people in Central America that the anthropologists do not know about, who use cacao. It's the center of their culture. They journey with it into other dimensions. And it's fun to go with them. Meet adjacent realities, that would be my term for it in my world. In realizing that real chocolate was a facilitator for whatever you want to use it for anything you want to connect to. And in realizing I couldn't go out in Guatemala and get it, so I started producing it. And that production basically grew to about, now we buy about 15 tons a year. We'll buy about 25 tons this year. This facilitator, connection and partnership facilitator, is now moving in very actively to the creativity world. Artists and musicians use it. Writers use it. Coders find it unbelievable for what it makes their brains work like they always thought a brain ought to work. I had a gentleman come to the door, one of the very first people to buy cacao from me. And I knew he didn't meditate, so I said, well, what do you do with this stuff? And he said, well, I'm a writer. And the way I like to write is to hold 3 separate storylines in my head and weave them together in the story I'm writing. But with a cup of your cacao, I'm able to hold 9 simultaneous stories, 3 times the amount, and weave them all together. It makes sense, people like what I'm writing, and most importantly, I'm having more fun as a writer. In medical journals, you will see that you have, with an average dose of cacao, not even as much as we use ceremonially, you have about 30% more blood flowing to your brain and the rest of your body. That's about 80% additional oxygenation. So brains work better. Especially the connection going on between left brain, right brain, rational, intuitive, head, heart, whatever you would do for creativity or productivity. This is a major facilitator for everything. She kept telling me, you've got to start researching. I contacted friends working with the first Mayan shamans in the Mexican Yucatan, and they didn't know anything about cacao. They asked their teachers didn't know any. Shamans are now using it. There are Guatemalan shamans that use it. There are shamans elsewhere. but again, they're unknown by the anthropologists. The ones that I've met do not want to be known by the outside world. So I asked the cacao spirit, and I said to her, why don't you give me an explanation of the big picture? A week and a half later, I was in the internet place reading an anthropological journal, and I ran into a myth from Central and I think South American tribes that said that when mankind gets out of harmony with the natural world, chocolate cacao comes out of the rainforest to open people's hearts and reestablish the balance. And I said, oh, well, that's what I'm doing. I am assisting a plant spirit medicine in moving out of the rainforest and into the Western world in a new way. Because Hershey's, Cadbury's, the Mars companies, M&Ms and Doves and that sort of thing, is missing a little over 99% of the active ingredients in real chocolate. They are removed. The raw food stuff is highly variable, especially the powder is extremely variable. It can have from 25 to 85% of the active ingredients of the kind of stuff that we use. There is such an amazing batch-to-batch variability in cacao out of the same rainforest with the same people that I took to asking the cacao spirit where to go. And she'd send me to a market, she'd send me to a small coastal town, and I'd find the deposito, the guy that bought it from the people that walked it or trucked it out of the mountains. Or occasionally she'd give me turn-by-turn directions. It was like having a cacao GPS. We still source it with cacao spirit input because otherwise it's not consistent. I began processing it under directions from the cacao spirit, basically in the way that it was been traditionally made. I mean, we don't use a metate with a fire under it, things like that. We hand peel it, which is different than almost every other place. You cannot see the moldy beans unless you're looking at them. We have 20 families here in San Marcos that hand peel the cacao. They throw the moldy beans to the chickens make absurdly rich eggs. Then the cacao comes back here and we have some large white-bottomed sorting trays. And it's poured out on the tray and gone through a second time. So we throw out a lot of mold. Our waste is higher than anyone. People bring us cacao from Peru, mostly, occasionally from Ecuador, and most of it is what we call too buzzy, no focus because of the caffeine. The stimulation, the speediness of it does not really work for a good focus.
Have you had cacao from South America or outside of Guatemala that you would consider ceremonial grade?
Yes, I have had some from indigenous tribes. The easiest way to tell is generally, not always, but generally, the really good stuff is small seeded. There are now quite a number of people using the ceremonial cacao name that we started, and some of them on occasion actually have ceremonial grade cacao. Most of them, they just grind everything. The peeling machines do not work without high roasting because the beans are cracked up into chunks and the skins are blown away. So you need a fairly high roast. To us it tastes burnt. The cacao spirit basically tells us, well, you know, if you want to do it in the old way, don't burn it. If you want the full energies to come through, don't burn it. So given that we're using a diesel-powered mill, because we're grinding over 400 pounds at a time, we try and make it as close to the traditional chocolate and the cacao spirit's instructions as we can. And we make as best an attempt to get source material that meets these qualifications. Basically only once in the last 15 years have I gotten cacao that I didn't like. The energy was fine, but the taste wasn't. My sweetheart and I, Barbara, we drink it almost every day, not quite. I love it. So that's the story. And that's our fun.